Before we start this episode, a large thank you to Cal Sant, James Ransom, and Justice Newman for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Alright guys, hello. Today we're going to add the ability to drink from an Estus Flask into our game, which will include adding consumable items and the inputs to activate consumables. So first, on our input handler, I'm going to say public bool x input, and I'm going to go down here, and on enable, I'm just going to say input actions.playerActions.x.performed plus equals I equals greater than x input equals true. So when I'm hitting the button, the X button on the controller, the X input is turning true. And then right down below here, I'm just going to say private void, and I'm going to say handle use consumable input. Then we're going to say if x input, we're going to open up some curly braces, we're going to say x input is equal to false, and then we're going to put some pseudo code here, and we're going to say use current consumable item, or current consumable. Alright, so I've already went ahead and made the x input under player controls, but I will show you that momentarily. I'm just going to say handle use consumable input here in the tick input, so it's called reframe, and then I am going to go down to here. I'm going to go to player controls just to show you. Player actions, and there is my X input. As you can see, it's X on the keyboard or the West button on the gamepad if you're using a controller. Okay, so next we actually have to make the consumable item itself. So let's go to the items, and then we're going to go where the item script is, right click, create a C# script. I'm going to call this one consumable item. Now, we're also going to make a script derived from this one in the future too, specifically for the flasks and their functions, but for now let's start with this. So let's open up the script. I'm going to say namespace is SG. I'm going to erase my start and update functionality as we will not need them. This derives from our item class, so let's change that from model behavior to item. And then we're going to say, let's make a header first, put some values here. I'm going to say item quantities or item quantity. And then we can do some pseudo code here for max amount and the current amount. Actually, you know what? Since we're here, we might as well throw these in anyway. We're not going to actually play with the max and minimum values in this episode, but we'll put them there for the future episodes. So we're going to say public int max item amount, public int current item amount. And then we're going to say right below this, let's make a header. We will say item model, because all consumable objects have a model that is displayed. We're going to say public aim object for the item model itself, whether it be an Estus Flask or a throwing knife or a firebomb, etc., etc. Then we're going to say header animations or item animations, whatever you want to say. And then we're going to say public string, and you can say consumable animation. So this could be drinking for the Estus Flask, be throwing for the throwing knives or the firebomb, etc., etc. And then a public bool for is interacting, which means are you freezing all other movements when performing this consumable action. For the Estus Flask, that is not the case. We're just halving our movement speed, but we're going to do that on another episode. So then we're going to say public virtual void attempt to consume item. And we're going to need to pass our player animator manager so we can play the animations. And we're going to need a couple other things too, but for now we'll just keep it as simple as that until we get to those things. So what are we going to need to do? Well, we're going to say if current item amount is greater than 0, which means you're not empty, so we can actually use this. We're going to say player animator manager dot play target animation consume animation and pass the is interacting bool. Else we're going to play, I'm just going to play the shrug animation, which would indicate that you are out of the item and you cannot do anything. And I'm going to set is interacting to true because that freezes you in place and gives time for a player to hit you if you make a mistake of trying to use an item that you don't have. Okay, I'm going to save that. Now, let's go into the items folder again and let's right click. Let's create a new C# script and we're going to call this flask item. This will be for our Estus Flask. And as you could have guessed, this is going to derive from the consumable object because it is a type of consumable item. Put my namespace down, and I'm going to erase the start and update functions. I'm going to say header Flask type, because we have Estus or Ashen. Ashen restores focus points. Estus restores your health. Public bool, Estus Flask. Public bool, Ashen Flask. I'm going to say header again. And then we'll say recovery amount. And this will be how much you restore in either the health stat or the focus point stat. Or mana, whatever you would like to call it. Okay, cool. Now just below that, I'm going to make another header. And I'm going to say recovery FX. And this will be the effects that will play when you drink the Estus Flask and you successfully restore HP. So in Dark Souls, it's usually just like a yellow glow that'll pop up on the player along with the sound effect. So you can drag in whatever effects you have right there. And I'm going to say public override. Oh, I have to derive this from our consumable item. We're going to say attempt to consume item. But we're going to need to add a few things here. So what are we doing first? Well, we're going to want to add health to our player or focus points. And then we're going to want to instantiate the model in the player's hand and play the animation of him drinking it or her. And then we're going to want to play recovery effects on the player if we successfully drink the Estus Flask before we're attacked or damaged. And I think that's it. So let's make a new script on the player model. Let's call it Player Effects Manager, and this will handle all things in the future, like being poisoned, healing, etc., etc. And when I say healing, I mean through effects of items or auras or things in the game, not through spells. So if you're running through a swamp, you get poisoned, we'll process it here. If you have toxic, we'll process it here. If you're being healed by an Estus Flask or an item effect, we'll process it here, etc., etc. So we're going to want to say public game object current effects. And all this is going to be is basically the current particle effects. I'm going to actually change that to current particle effects of whatever effect your player currently has going on. So if you're poisoned, we're going to play like a poison mist over your player. If you're passing on an Estus healing effect, we're going to pass on the Estus Flask effect after we attempt to drink it. And if we successfully drink it, we'll play it here. I'll show you why we need to put this here momentarily. It's to do with animation events. Okay. So next, let's come back over to the consumable item. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to add a weapon slot manager so we can instantiate this in the right hand. And we're also going to need to add the player effects manager that we just created. Now, as you know, this is going to break our Flask override. So we need to copy all this up here. And we're going to paste this on the Flask override section. And we're also going to call this base code, because if not, we won't play our animation. So let's paste that there. And let's go into this function here. We're going to say base.attempt to consume item. And all that means is it's going to also play the function from the base class this derives from. So it will play both logics from the deriving class and then this class here. Let's pass our player animator manager, the weapon slot manager, and the player effects manager. Okay, so let's start knocking off this pseudo code here and get these functions up one by one. So let's go back to the player effects manager. We're going to say public void. We're going to say effect player stats. Actually, we're going to keep it simple first. We're not going to dive into this stuff. We're going to just say heal player from effect. So this could be your Estus Flask, etc., etc. We're going to pass an int for the heal amount. I'm just going to rename this. Actually, yeah, that'll work for now. That'll work for now. I might change this in a second. I'm going to think about it. But for now, we're going to call player stats up here. And then on awake, whoops, can't put the awake right there. There's a variable right below it. On awake, we're going to call the player stats, and that will be get component in parent, as the player stats sits on the object above this one in the hierarchy. Okay, that looks good. Now on the heal player, we're just going to say player stats dot heal player, and we're going to pass the heal amount. Looks good. Now let's go over to our Flask item, and we can knock this off. We can say player effects manager dot current particle effects equals recovery effects, and then we can say, actually, I just had an idea. If we're going to pass the recovery effects anyway, we can actually just pass the healing amount too. So I'm just going to say public int amount to heal, to be healed. And I'm just going to erase this need for a heal amount. And we can just call amount to be healed. And we'll pass that from the function over here. So we can say player effects manager dot amount to be healed is equal to health recovery amount. And this is all assuming that you're using an Estus Flask. If you want to do the Ashen Flask, you can just do the same thing, but say if is Ashen, if is Estus, and replace the values with your FP instead. Then we're going to say game object flask equals instantiate item model weapon slot manager dot right hand slot. Now, since we're using this dot transform in the right hand slot, we're actually going to need to make the flask like a weapon, and by that I mean put it in a pivot. And we're going to multiply its dimensions by 100 because it's going to fit in our player's hand, much like our weapons do. Then we're going to say weapon slot manager dot right hand slot dot unload weapon. This will get rid of the weapon we're currently holding, but not remove it from our inventory. Just hide it for now. So when we have the flask, it doesn't look like we're holding the flask and the weapon at the same time. Okay, cool. So far, so good. We're going to say public game object instantiated effects model. So this is going to be for the flask we actually instantiate. And then we're going to say player effects manager dot instantiated model equals item model. Let's put that right there. Okay, and we are good on this one. Let's go to the player effects manager here, and right below here we're going to say we need to instantiate those healing effects when we actually heal. So let's say game object, whoops, game object heal particles. I'll just call it healing particles. You can call it healing effects, whatever you want to call it. And we're just going to say equals instantiate current particle effects, and I'm just going to instantiate. You can just say transform. I'm just going to use player stats dot transform, but just basically it will instantiate at the feet of our player. All right, cool. That looks good. And right below that, let's just say instantiated effects model equals null. Actually, let's just say destroy instantiated effects model. Excellent. Then we're going to say weapon slot manager up here, and let's call that on the awake, and that will be weapon slot manager equals get component weapon slot manager because it sits in the same game object as this. And then we're going to say we're going to load back our weapons after we're done here. So we're going to say weapon slot manager dot load weapon on slot. Actually, what we can do is we can actually go to the weapon slot manager and we can just refresh the weapons on both hands whenever we're done an effect. So let's just go here, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a quick new function that's just going to refresh both weapons on our hands. So right where it says load weapon on slot, right above that, let's say public void. I'm just going to say load both weapons on slots. And I'm just going to call load weapon on slot twice and just basically load the weapons from our inventory in our left hand and right hand. So load weapon on slot, I'm going to say player inventory dot right hand, and that will be false because it's not your right weapon, and that will load the right-handed weapon back. And then I'm going to say load weapon on slot player inventory dot left weapon, and that is true because it is a left weapon. And then I'm just going to call this function after we're done processing our healing effects. So we'll just load back and refresh the weapons on both hands. Okay, and that looks good. Excellent. Alright, next I'm going to drag in my drink animation. Just going to put that here in the override layer and drag it to the empty. Tick foot IK. Next I'm going to create an item. Oh, we forgot to make our item as an asset, creating an asset. So let's go over here into the Flask item. Let's say create asset menu. Let's say menu equals, I'm just going to say items slash consumables slash flask or Estus Flask, whatever you want to call it. Just say flask because it could be either. And now let's create this in our project real quick. So I'm going to right click here, create, items, consumables, flask. Gonna call it Estus Flask. You can do the exact same thing for the Ashen Flask too if you'd like. Just do the opposite and tick Ashen. I'm gonna say item model is flask, which I already have created. Max item amount is 10. Current item amount, I'll just say 10 for now. We'll mess with those values later. The item name will be Estus Flask, and the consumable animation will be drink. Is interacting is not true because you can still walk around while you drink in Dark Souls 3. If you want Dark Souls 1, you can check that to be true, so you're frozen in place. I'm actually going to move this drink animation, I think. Yeah, so it's waist up, so I'm going to delete it and put it on the upper body, and we'll still be able to walk while doing this. And in a future episode, I'll actually make it so we can walk, but our movement is like cut in half, so you walk very slow while you're drinking. This is the flask, just something very simple I took from a pack and colored yellow. All right, take off Estus Flask. Health recovery amount, let's just say 250. And recovery effects, I think I have that healing circle from the spell video. Yeah, so I'll just use that. Okay, cool. Now we're almost done. We just have to set up a couple things. Like right now, we have to make the flask operate like a weapon, and I have to make the animation event get set up on the drinking animation. So let's go to the drink animation, and let's go right over here, right there is where it's good. And let's use, where did I put it? Here we go. Heal player from effect. So if you make it to that part of the animation, you'll heal. If not, you'll break out of it. And let's open up our player inventory. And wherever on the top here, we have to add a current consumable item, which is just the current consumable equipped in our quick slots that you're going to use. I'm actually going to put that below this stuff right here. Yep, there we go. Okay. Looks good. And now on our input handler, let's say player inventory dot current consumable dot attempt to consume item, and we got to pass our player animation manager, our weapon slot manager, and our player effects manager. Now, if you don't want to be able to spam this, we're going to make a check in a future video where if you started using a consumable, you won't be able to start again until the item has been used or you've been knocked out of it. But we'll get to those little polish elements in a later video. Let's get the main effects done for now. So let's call our player effects manager up here, and on awake, I'm just going to call it down here. It is in the component below this, so it would be get component in children. Player effects manager equals get component in children, player effects manager, and I think we're good. Let's save that. I think we can test this now. Let's see. Okay, we have an error. What's this? Oh, okay, we have to call the player animator manager on the script as well. I thought we had that up here. I guess not. So anywhere in particular below here, let's call the player animator manager, and we're going to call that below in the code. And again, it sits on the game object below this one. So player animator manager equals get component in children, player animator manager. Then we should be okay to test it, I believe. I think I have to edit a couple of small things. Let's check it out real quick. So let's actually equip the Estus Flask in our consumable. And before we move on, let's put true on this part here on the attempt to consume item so we can rotate after we've started using the item. And lastly, let's go into the game here, drag in the butcher sword and the flask. Let's unpack these prefabs, both of them. I'm using the butcher sword because it's set up to look normal in our hand. Let's drag the flask in under the weapon pivot. We have to unpack the butcher sword first though. And let's reset the model transform, and as you can see, we can kind of use this as a cheat code because wherever the handle of the sword is where the player is going to grab the flask when it spawns. So let's drag it like right back here, and then let's delete the model of the butcher sword. Let's rename this game object to flask, and let's create a prefab of it. I'm going to delete my old one there, and then I'm going to use this as the prefab that instantiates in the player's hand on the item. So let's go back to our flask item. Let me just search that real quick. Estus. Yeah, okay. And then, whoops. Let's go back to the main folder here. Drag in this flask. Cool. Alright. Now, back in the attempt to consume item, I actually put this in the wrong place. Let's copy this and put it right here. And then what we want to do is not pass the item model, but we have to say player effects dot instantiate effects model equals the flask, the instantiated object. Otherwise, we can't destroy it in the scene. So I made a mistake there. And then over here on the player effects manager, now we can destroy the object that we've passed along. So we can just say destroy, and we could say instantiated effects model dot game object. Okay, now we should be good to go. So As you can see, I'm damaged. If I press the X button, I will haul the Estus Flask and drink, and it plays the healing effects, and my health is restored. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment. It does help appease the YouTube algorithm gods, and I will see you next time on the next episode.